On the Western Front in World War I, German forces had occupied Luxembourg and Belgium. Paris was at their target. But the situation on the Eastern Front was completely different. There, Russian forces were attacking German land. The invading Russian army was much superior in both numbers and strength. The Russians had crossed the German border. German commanders panicked and shouted to their high command, which saved them, "We can't fight this polar bear." It was a do-and-die situation for the Germans. They had to defend their homeland at any cost. Could the German forces stop this polar bear? The weak Ottoman Empire on the front of Gallipoli countered superpower Britain and France, and how it did that? First World War's second episode will show you all this. East Prussia was the province of Germany that Russia was attacking. It was located on the border of the Russian Empire. But the German High Command estimated that the Russians would need at least 6 weeks to attack this province. After such a long time, our forces on the Western Front would have captured Paris and routed the Allied forces. Then we will bring our forces against Russia on the Eastern Front. Thus, Russia will not be able to take any major military action against Germany. Under this strategy, a very small army was deployed for the defense of Eastern Prussia. Most of the army was sent to Belgium and France on the Western Front. You have learned in the previous video that the Germans invaded France from Belgium under the Schlieffen Plan. However, the attack failed and German forces were unable to capture Paris. Like the Schlieffen Plan, the Germans' calculations in Eastern Front also failed, in such a way that the Russians, instead of mobilizing their army for 6 weeks on the East Prussian front, mobilized it for just 2. Against the 166,000 Germans, the Russians had 460,000 soldiers. The Russian war plan was also remarkable. The Russians had divided their army into the First and Second Armies. The First Army was commanded by General Rennenkampf. This army had to attack East Prussia from the east. The Second Army, under the command of General Alexander Samsonov, was to attack from the south. As per the Russian plan, the First Army would first advance towards the East Prussian capital of Königsberg. When the German forces come to meet it, the Second Russian Army will enter Germany and from the backside capture Königsberg. The German forces would then be trapped between these two Russian forces and either destroyed or forced to surrender. Now the Russians' plan was great, but it had training and technical flaws. That is, the Russian soldiers were not fully prepared for this battle. Second, they were not familiar with the area either. Between the positions of the Russian First Army and Second Army were many lakes known as the Masurian Lakes. Due to these lakes, these two armies could not even help each other in time. Another major problem was that the commanders of the First and Second Armies, General Paul and General Samsonov, were at odds with each other. Whether it was professional jealousy or something else, we do not know, but the two were unlikely to help each other effectively.
Apart from all these, there was another big problem. Russian commanders had no secret system to communicate with their forces. That is, they could not send messages to each other in code words. This was because each military unit had its own codebook for wireless communication, which differed from others. That is, this was also a technical training flaw. So the Russian commanders decided that on the wireless they would send messages directly rather than using code words. So the Germans would also listen to their conversations on their wireless. As such, the Germans would know the Russians' plan. However, despite all, the Russians still had the advantage of numbers. So in the first few days, their attack was very successful. The First Army crossed the German border into East Prussia on August 15th. Against it, the German Eighth Army was commanded by Maximilian Prittwitz. The Russians defeated the German forces twice, on August 17th and on August 20th. Meanwhile, the German commander Prittwitz also received intelligence that the Russian Second Army had entered Germany. He sent a message to the German High Command in Berlin that my army was about to be surrounded by the enemy. Allow me to evacuate East Prussia. But the German High Command, instead of listening to him, dismissed him. In his place, he sent 2 seasoned German commanders to East Prussia. These new commanders were Hindenburg and Ludendorff. The 68-year-old Hindenburg had retired, but he was specially called on duty for this important battle. Ludendorff was stationed on the Western Front at the time. The battle for the capture of the Belgian city of Liege, shown in the last video part 1, was also fought under his command. The Germans were victorious in that battle and they had advanced to France after occupying Liege. So Ludendorff, the winner of this important battle, was sent to East Prussia as Hindenburg's chief of staff, his assistant. When these two commanders reached East Prussia, they met a German officer who already had a great plan to defeat the Russians. This officer was the 8th Army's Chief of Operations, Colonel Max Hoffmann. East Prussia had a great network of railway lines. Hoffmann's plan was that the present before the Russian First Army will be moved by train to the left flank of the Russian Second Army. As this army advanced, the Germans would surround it from the back and cut off its supply line and destroy it. He also presented this plan to Ludendorff and Hindenburg. Both commanders liked it. They made some technical changes to it and implemented it immediately. A part of the German army through trains speedily sent to the left flank of the Russian Second Army. After that, German troops also gathered in the way of the Second Army's advance. Geography helped the Germans a lot in this deployment. These soldiers could easily hide in forests and small settlements and approach the enemy without being seen. On the other hand, the enemy had difficulty in contacting its various units in the wars. The result was that when the Second Russian Army entered East Prussia, its various units were scattered here and there in the jungles. So now, the Germans from the front and sides started attacking the enemy troops separately, surrounding the rival forces, while this part of the German army on the left flank of the Russians reached the enemy's rear and closed the door of retreat on them. Meanwhile, the Germans also launched attacks on the First Army to slow down its advance. The German plan was successful in both places. The advance of the Russian First Army also slowed, and the Second Army began to be surrounded by the Germans. The constant clashes got most of the Second Army encircled by 27th or 28th August.
The Germans heavily bombarded this encirclement for 2 days. Thousands of Russian soldiers were killed in this shelling. Meanwhile, the Russian First Army, due to animosity of the commanders and its own military difficulties, could not come to their aid. Thus, the Second Army was left alone, and its soldiers began to surrender. By August 31, a large part of the army had surrendered. 48,000 soldiers out of 150,000 of the Second Army were killed, and 92,000 were captured. Only 10,000 Russian soldiers could reach Russia with their lives. Apart from this, the Germans also captured 500 Russian cannons. The army seized so large munitions from the Russians that they were loaded into 60 trains and sent to Berlin. Russian commander Alexander Samsonov was not captured, but he was so saddened by the defeat that he shot himself with a revolver. Compared to all this, the German casualties were very low. Only 13,873 German soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing. After destroying the Second Army, the Germans sent most of the forces from this front to confront the Russian First Army. However, the Russian First Army continued to advance into German land. By September 10, it had reached Königsberg. However, the Germans pushed him back by making heavy attacks. The fighting continued for the next few months. By February 1915, all Russian troops had been expelled from East Prussia. The Germans had successfully defended their country. This battle was called the Battle of Tannenberg. One of the reasons was the same name of the nearby town. A commemorative silver coin was also issued on this victory. It showed Hindenburg standing with a sword and the Russian bear lying at his feet. Tannenberg's influence was profound. After this war, the Germans became an invincible power in East Prussia, but their ally, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, appeared helpless before the Russians. In World War I, the Russians inflicted a defeat on the Austrians that their humiliation of defeat at Tannenberg somewhat lessened. This battle was fought in Lemberg, Austria. The city of Lemberg, now in Ukraine, was the capital of the Austrian province of Galicia during World War I. From August 23 to September 11, 1914, on the Galician front, the Russian and Austrian armies fought a fierce battle. Such a war that in many places even swords were used. At least 100,000 Austrians were killed in this battle, 220,000 were wounded, and 100,000 soldiers were taken prisoner. In comparison, more than 150,000 Russian soldiers were killed and wounded, while 40,000 were arrested. As a result of this battle, Lemberg was occupied by the Russians. It was a humiliating defeat for Austria. On this defeat, Austrian Field Marshal Franz Conrad said that if Franz Ferdinand were alive today, he would have shot me. This Franz Ferdinand was the same Crown Prince of Austria whose assassination led to the First World War. So the victory at Lemberg boosted the morale of the Russians. They advanced further, and about 96 kilometers west of Lemberg laid siege to a town Przemyśl. Many protective forts around the routes and surroundings were built. More than 100,000 Austrian soldiers in these forts resisted the Russians for several months. Fierce battles took place for the capture of the city's protective forts. Soldiers kept killing each other with swords and bayonets. The siege of the city lasted from September 16, 1914 to March 22, 1915, that is, about 133 days. During that, Russian bombardment made a large part of the city a pile of rubble. Many forts were also badly damaged. When further resistance became impossible, the Austrian army surrendered. It is said that when the Austrian emperor was informed of this, yet another defeat, he burst into tears. So, in early 1915, the Russian victory on Austrian front was its triumphant march. But from here, the situation started to reverse.
Germany, Austria's ally, came to its rescue. So, in July 1915, the Russian army began to withdraw from all fronts to take up better positions. This retreat was called the Great Retreat. Taking advantage of this retreat, Austria not only regained most of its territory, but the Germans and Austrians also captured a large part of Russia, which you can see on the map. 1915 was not only a year for Austria and Germany, but it was also a year of success for their third ally, the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire joined the First World War in November 1914. The immediate reason for this move by the Ottomans was that British Navy Minister Winston Churchill had seized 2 Turkish ships. These ships were built by the Ottomans from Britain and paid for in full. As the First World War started, Churchill seized these ships and refused to deliver. One ship was named HMS Arran and handed over to the British Navy. The second ship, which was not fully completed, was dismantled and its parts were used elsewhere. This illegal action of Great Britain fell on Turks' nerves. The Turks had collected donations from the public for these ships. The Turkish people turned against Britain for this breach of promise. Germany gave its 2 warships, Goeben and Breslau, to Turkey to fill this void. Turkey and Germany came closer to each other. On November 11, 1914, the Ottoman Caliph Mehmed V declared jihad against the Allied powers, Britain, France, and Russia. In a strikeback, the Allied powers planned an attack on its territory of Gallipoli. This plan was also made by Winston Churchill. Gallipoli was located on the banks of the Strait of Dardanelles. If the Allies were to capture it, their ships could easily pass through and capture the Turkish capital of Constantinople. Thereby, the sea route to the Black Sea via the Bosphorus Straits was open to them, after which they could easily deliver arms and supplies to their ally Russia. In addition, they could also attack German ally Bulgaria from the east. Then, by putting pressure on Greece and Romania along with Bulgaria, they could also force them to go to war against Germany. That is, if this plan had succeeded, the British and French forces would have joined forces with Greece and Romania to attack Germany and Austria from the east, while on the Western Front they were already fighting the Germans. That is, Germany would get surrounded by them from both the east and the west. On paper, the plan was brilliant. Wars with Russia and other states had already weakened the Ottoman Empire. The Allies were convinced that their plan was foolproof. But in any fight, planning becomes the first casualty. The same thing happened with Britain and France. The Turks and their German allies were fully aware of the enemy's intentions, so Germany sent a mission to Turkey under Lieutenant General Otto Liemann's command. According to the instructions of this military mission, the Turkish Fifth Army took up position in Gallipoli. Lieutenant Colonel Mustafa Kemal Pasha was also a commander of this Ottoman army. He was commanding the 19th Division of the Turks. Along with the ground forces, the Turkish naval force also became active. A Turkish ship, the Nusrat, laid mines under the Dardanelles Strait. On March 18, 1915, 16 ships of Britain and France entered the Dardanelles Strait. Their aim was to remove the mines laid by Nusrat, but the bombardment of the Turkish artillery from both sides of the strait did not give them the chance. In this war, a 26-year-old brave Turkish gunner, Seyit Ali Çabuk, made history. 375-kilogram shells were put in the cannon this brave man was firing on the enemy. No ordinary person could lift such heavy shells. That is why there was a crane for this purpose. But this crane, attached to Seyit Ali Çabuk's gun, went out of order. After which, Ali Çabuk did that he himself carried the heavy shells on his back and brought them to his gun and started to fire. It was an unprecedented demonstration of bravery and hard work. But obviously, it was an act done in the heat of the moment. So once after the battle, when he was asked to lift an equally heavy shell, he failed to lift it. He was awarded the Gallipoli Star by the Ottoman Empire. This medal was also given to those who, like Seyit Ali, proved brave at Gallipoli. Mustafa Kemal, the founder of modern Turkey, was also given this medal. Monuments of Seyit Ali Çabuk have been erected in many places in Turkey. On March 16th, due to the heavy bombardment by the Turks, the crews of the Allied ships could not attend to the mines. These ships kept engaged in retaliatory fire and in the process started hitting mines. In this action, 2 British and 1 French ships were sunk, while 3 were badly damaged. The advance of the Allied powers halted, and their fleet returned from the Dardanelles Strait. Besides this fleet, many British ships were also beaten at the Gallipoli front. But on April 25th, the ground war also began. It goes Turk commander Mustafa Kemal told German commander Otto Limann where the enemy could land. He said that the enemy would either land at Cape Helles or at Gaba Tepe. The German commander did not agree with him, but Mustafa Kemal's 19th Division was deployed in such a place that it could reach both these places very quickly. Then the enemy made the first landing at Cape Helles, that is, at the very place Kemal Atatürk had already indicated. The Australian and New Zealand forces, known as Anzac, landed first. These soldiers climbed the coastal cliffs and entered the Turkish territory. The Turkish forces led by Mustafa Kemal blocked the way of the Allies. Then a long series of bloody encounters began. In these battles, Mustafa Kemal well demonstrated his leadership abilities. On an occasion when the Turkish soldiers were fleeing from the field, Mustafa Kemal had inspired spirit in them to bring them back to the battlefield. Meanwhile, Allied forces also continued to land on the coast at intervals. Indian and French soldiers were also included among them. They were a total of 489,000 soldiers. In comparison, the Turks had 315,500 soldiers. But the Turks bravely resisted this army everywhere. Scenes of humanitarianism were also seen during the war. A Turkish soldier carried a wounded Australian soldier to his comrades. This monument shows that even in the worst enmity and amid wars, humanity can be sustained. The Battle of Gallipoli lasted for months. The Allies repeatedly changed tactics and tried to break the Turkish defense line, but failed.
The Turks had the advantage of taking positions on high ground. From here, they could estimate the enemy and stop it. That's why when the Allied forces could not advance far into Gallipoli, they dug out trenches. That is, trench warfare also began here, as on the Western Front. However, there was a difference. Unlike the Western Front, the Allies here did not prolong trench warfare. As there, the Allies were compelled to defend Paris and France at all costs. But the long trench warfare at Gallipoli was of no use. They knew they could not win on the Gallipoli front, which meant so much power would be wasted on unnecessary fronts. You know, the soldiers in the trenches fight diseases more than enemy bombardment, so they quietly began to withdraw their army. By January 1916, the Allied forces left Gallipoli so quietly that the Turks could not get a hint of it. The Allied powers installed dummy guns and dummy soldiers in such a way that the Turkish forces long believed the Allied soldiers were still there. When the Turkish forces, after a long, realized the real Allied forces had left and that there were dummy guns and dummy soldiers, they could not do anything because the Allied powers had left the field and retreated. And in this successful retreat, only 2 soldiers of the Allied forces were injured. This is an unforgettable event in war history. The Battle of Gallipoli lasted from April 1915 to January 1916, for about 9 months. In this war, the Allied powers, including Britain and France, all forces had a total of 348,000 soldiers killed, wounded, and captured, while the Ottoman forces had to suffer the loss of more than 160,000 soldiers. Some say the loss on both sides was equal. Whatever may be, in the end, the forces of the Ottoman Empire were victorious. After the Gallipoli defeat, the British government came under severe pressure. Winston Churchill suffered the consequences of this defeat, for he was the mastermind of the Gallipoli offensive. He was removed as First Lord, the Minister of the Navy. On the Eastern Front, the year 1915 proved very good for the Central Powers, but in those months the Germans and the Allies had a stalemate on Western Front. The Germans launched a major attack to break this stalemate. This attack proved the longest battle of the First World War. What was this attack and its end? Who showed the French the way to victory? All this will be shown to you in Part 3 of the First World War. Thank you for watching this World War I Part 2 video.